The universe did not announce the Emperor's arrival with fanfare. There was no herald, no golden light splitting the stars, no choir of angels proclaiming his return to the physical world. There was only a wound. It opened 300 kilometers off the port bow of the UNSC Prowler Silent Cartographer's Ghost, a vessel whose entire purpose was to watch things that were not supposed to be seen. Lieutenant Commander Yael Ostrander had spent 11 years in ONI's Deep Reconnaissance Division watching for Covenant fleet movements near Forerunner installations. She had cataloged 17 first contacts, survived 4 ambushes, and once watched a Covenant carrier glass an insurrectionist colony from a distance of 200,000 kilometers without flinching. She was not a woman given to panic. When the rift opened, she panicked. It was not a slipspace rupture. The Ghost's AI, a sharp-tongued construct named Perrin, dismissed that possibility in 0.003 seconds. Slipspace had a signature, a specific distortion of local spacetime that UNSC and Covenant sensors had cataloged exhaustively over decades of warfare. This was something else. The rift tore like fabric, edges burning with a light that Perrin could not classify spectrally, colors registering outside the instrument range entirely. It lasted 9 seconds. Then it closed. Then the Emperor of Mankind stood in the void of space and did not die. "Contact," Perrin said, his voice stripped of its usual sarcasm by something that might have been awe. "Single entity, bipedal, human morphology. No life support equipment detected. Hull temperature reads..." "Yael, this reading can't be right." "Tell me anyway." "The entity is generating its own thermal envelope. Independent of any suit or external system, it's standing in hard vacuum, and it is warm." Ostrander pressed her face to the optical scope, bypassing the digital feed on instinct. What she saw would occupy her nightmares for the rest of her life. Not because it was monstrous, but because it wasn't. He was enormous, yes, 3 meters at least, encased in gold armor that caught the distant starlight like a second sun. A great fur-lined cloak spreading behind him in the vacuum silence. His face was visible through no helmet she could identify. Exposed to space, angular, ancient, framed by gold. His eyes were closed. His hands were at his sides, gauntleted fingers curled slightly, and he was utterly, completely still. Then his eyes opened, and even across 300 kilometers of vacuum, Perrin's optical systems caught the light they produced. "General quarters," Ostrander said quietly, "and get me a direct line to Section 3, Priority Obsidian. Now." The year was 2549. The Human Covenant War had consumed 24 years, 400 colonies, and billions of lives. Humanity was not losing. Humanity had already lost in every strategic metric that mattered. They simply had not stopped fighting yet. Reach still stood for now. Earth remained unglassed for now. Every UNSC commander, every admiral, every Black Ops director in ONI's labyrinthine hierarchy operated under the same unspoken understanding. They were buying time, not winning a war. Against that backdrop, His Shield World Trevelyan hung in the dark of the Etron Harborage system, a forerunner installation of staggering size, its secrets barely scratched by the UNSC science teams that had been quietly cataloging it for 3 years. Those science teams were now receiving alerts. Dr. Keiko Mara had been elbow-deep in a Forerunner data terminal when the lights changed. The installation's ambient bioluminescence, soft blue, constant, reassuring in its alien steadiness, shifted. A pulse moved through the walls like a heartbeat through stone, and then every monitor in the research bay flooded with Forerunner glyphs she had never seen before. In 4 years of translation work, she had developed a working vocabulary of roughly 12,000 Forerunner symbols. These were not among them. She photographed them anyway, hands shaking. Shuin sent the burst to her team's linguist with a single annotation: priority, unknown class, possible threat designation. The linguist's response came back in 40 seconds. Not threat, not welcome. Something between the two. The closest translation I can find is witness. The installation was watching. If you want to see more factions enter the Halo universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a sci-fi faction or character you'd want to see in the comments below. Finish the fight. Outside, in the void where the rift had deposited him, the Emperor of Mankind took his first breath of this universe and found it cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. In his universe, the universe he had shaped, bled for, built across 10,000 years of unrelenting will, the warp was omnipresent. It was a second skin, a reservoir, an ocean he had swum since before humanity had names for gods. He reached for it now reflexively, the way a man reaching for a wall in darkness expects to find stone. He found nothing. He stood in it for a long moment, processing. The Emperor of Mankind had not survived 10 millennia by panicking when the ground shifted beneath him. He turned his attention inward instead, cataloging what remained. His physical form, intact, fully armored, the sword of the Emperor at his hip, its disruption field operational. His mind, present, contained, no longer bleeding power into a warp that did not exist here. His psychic ability, still his, still vast, but sealed now within his own skull like light inside a lantern, rather than blazing outward into an infinite sea. Diminished in range, undiminished in depth. He turned slowly, and examined the structure that dominated the space ahead of him. The shield world, its exterior a mosaic of geometric precision and ancient silence. Forerunner work. He recognized the philosophical signature of it the same way a master architect recognizes the hand of a peer in a building they have never entered. Whoever built this had thought about the same problems he had spent millennia solving. Preservation, legacy, the question of what you leave behind when you are gone. He began to move toward it, crossing the vacuum with a calm that had no business existing, and the installation's lights pulsed again in response. Witness. The Emperor had been called many things. He had never been called that before. He found to his considerable surprise that he wanted to know why. The Prowler's silent cartographer's ghost did not intercept him. The Ostrander was many things. Aggressive, decisive, willing to make calls that would end careers if they went wrong. But she was not suicidal. Perrin had run 17 threat assessment models in the 4 minutes since the entity began moving toward the shield world, and every single one returned the same result. Insufficient data, recommend no engagement. The AI had then added, unprompted, something Ostrander had never heard from him before. I think we should be very careful. So they followed at distance, passive sensors only, and was in a way that 40 years of professional certainty had not prepared him for. It felt, in the deeply unscientific way, that prophets sometimes knew things before instruments confirmed them, like a theological event. He dispatched 3 phantoms toward the shield world while the carrier held position, and ordered his elite honor guard to full combat readiness. Then he retired to his sanctum and prayed, which was something he had not done with genuine urgency in a very long time. Inside the installation, the Emperor had been speaking with Dr. Mara for 40 minutes, and the conversation had become the strangest of her professional life, which was saying something, given that she had spent 4 years talking to Forerunner AIs. He asked questions with the focused efficiency of someone conducting an intelligence briefing, not a first contact. Where were they? What year was it by their reckoning? What was the nature of the dominant conflict? Who were the factions? What were the known unknowns? Mara answered carefully, watching his face for reactions and finding very few. He processed information the way a deep space navigation AI processed stellar coordinates. Intake, integration, no visible effort. When she described the Covenant, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, recognition of a pattern he had seen before, wearing different faces. A theocratic alliance, he said. Older species dominating younger ones through religious architecture. The faith is sincere but instrumentalized. The leadership understands that the doctrine is a control mechanism. The soldiers do not. That's a fairly accurate summary of what our xenologists concluded after 20 years of study, Mara said carefully. It is the oldest kind of empire, the Emperor said. I have built against it before. I have also, in moments I do not revisit with pride, built versions of it myself. He said this without apparent shame, as a historian recounts a fact. What are these forerunners to the Covenant? Gods, or the closest thing to gods the Covenant will accept. He was quiet for a moment. And the installations themselves? The rings your people have designated as Halo? Mara hesitated. The Halo briefing was classified at a level that made her current security clearance look like a library card. But the man, the being, sitting across from her had just walked through hard vacuum and been welcomed by a Forerunner installation that had resisted every UNSC attempt to open its outer gateways for 3 years. She made a judgment call that she suspected ONI would later describe as either brilliant or catastrophic. Super weapons, she said, disguised as habitable ring worlds. When fired, they kill all sentient life in a 25,000 light-year radius. The Covenant wants to activate them. They believe it will trigger transcendence. It will trigger extinction. The Emperor absorbed this without blinking. The Forerunners built a weapon capable of sterilizing the galaxy. To stop something worse, a parasite, we call it the Flood. Something moved through his expression then. Not surprise, but a specific kind of grim recognition. The look of a man hearing a description of an enemy he has never met but already understands. A consuming intelligence, he said. Parasitic, exponential. No negotiation, no conversion, no containment, only consumption or destruction. You've encountered something like it before. I have spent 10,000 years ensuring humanity survives things like it. He stood and the room's proportions rearranged themselves around him in Mara's perception. Not because he did anything, but because the space seemed to accommodate him differently than it accommodated ordinary people. Your situation is this. You are fighting a religious empire that wants to end all life while worshiping the weapons designed to do exactly that. Your military is outmatched technologically. Your population is being systematically exterminated. And somewhere in the dark, a parasite waits that makes the Covenant look like a minor inconvenience. Yes, Mara said. Suber, that's our situation. And your response has been to fight anyway. We don't have another option. He looked at her for a long moment with those impossible eyes. You always have another option, he said. Surrender is always available. Humanity has refused it for 24 years against an enemy that should have ended you in 5. That is not desperation. That is something else. He turned toward the corridor. I need to see the rest of this installation, and I need to see the Covenant. He got his wish sooner than either of them intended. Paran's voice crackled through Mara's earpiece. The AI had been maintaining a tight beam link to the installation's communication nodes, threading signal through Forerunner infrastructure to avoid Covenant detection. His voice was stripped of all affect, which was never a good sign. To Dr. Mara, 3 Covenant Phantoms just made entry through the installation's eastern gateway complex. The gateway opened for them. Armed boarding party. I'm reading elites, brutes, grunts. They're moving inward on a direct intercept with your position. Mara stood. Her team reached for weapons. The Emperor turned back toward the corridor mouth with the unhurried deliberateness of a man deciding which path to take on a morning walk. The Theocrats, he said. It was not a question. The Theocrats, Mara confirmed. The installation's lights pulsed once, that deep, resonant witness frequency, and then shifted to something new. Something that Mara's linguistic framework had no category for, a Forerunner designation that her translator rendered haltingly as convergence of significant things. The Emperor rolled his shoulders once, to the golden armor catching the Forerunner light, and walked toward the sound of approaching Covenant boots without breaking stride. The elites came around the corner in a standard 4-point breach formation. Energy swords ignited, plasma rifles charged, moving with the disciplined aggression of warriors who had never encountered anything in a Forerunner installation that could meaningfully threaten them. The lead elite, a major decorated with the purple trim of the Ministerium fleet, had cleared 47 human research sites in his career. He had learned to expect frightened scientists and underpowered sidearms. His threat assessment was already concluding before he finished turning the corner. Then he saw the Emperor, and his threat assessment caught fire and burned to the ground. The Major stopped, and the 3 elites behind him stopped. The grunts further back made a sound that in their language translated roughly as we would like to be somewhere else immediately. The brute flanking unit, coming from the parallel corridor, emerged into the junction and also stopped. And the lead brute, a Jiralhanae captain named Torvus, who had killed 11 Spartans in his career and feared nothing that breathed, took one look at the golden figure standing in the Forerunner light and felt something move through his chest that he would not have admitted was awe under any form of interrogation. The emperor looked at them the way a teacher looks at students who have arrived at the wrong classroom. The elite major recovered first, because Sangheili warriors were trained to recover from shock faster than any other species in the Covenant military. He leveled his plasma rifle and issued a challenge in Sangheili, the formal declaration of hostile intent that preceded all Covenant combat engagements with unknown entities. His translator bead rendered it in the Covenant's common tongue. Identify yourself before the eyes of the Forerunners, or be judged unworthy. The Emperor said nothing for 3 seconds. He appeared to be listening, not to the elite, but to something else, something in the walls or the air, or the frequencies that the installation was generating around them. Then he responded, and what came out of his mouth was not English and was not any language Mara's team recognized, but the elite major's mandibles spread slowly in an expression that the xenologist cataloged as profound involuntary surprise. Because whatever the Emperor had said, he had said it in Sangheili, not perfectly, not fluently, but structurally correct and phonologically precise enough that the major understood every word. He had said, I have read the bones of your language in the stones of this place. I am learning. Do not make me stop. The Forerunner installation had been teaching him. In 40 minutes of contact with its systems, it had fed him enough linguistic data to construct a working framework of Sangheili phonology. Mara filed this information in the part of her brain reserved for things that fundamentally revised her understanding of what was possible, and that part of her brain was getting very crowded. The standoff held for 7 seconds. Then a new voice cut through the corridor from behind the Covenant boarding party. Amplified, translated, carrying the precise cadences of prophet authority. High Minister Enduring Sanctity had not remained on his carrier. He had come himself, carried in a gravity throne that hummed softly as it rounded the corner, flanked by 2 elite honor guardsmen whose ceremonial spears were anything but ceremonial. Enduring Sanctity was old, even by prophet standards. His skin the color of old parchment, his eyes magnified behind optical enhancements, his robes the deep crimson of the ministerium's highest rank. He had cataloged Forerunner sites for 4 decades. He had stood in the presence of oracle constructs, walked the silent halls of shield worlds, pressed his hands against surfaces that remembered the Forerunner's passing. He believed with the absolute conviction that only genuine faith produces, that the Forerunners were divine. When he saw the Emperor, he stopped breathing for 4 seconds. It was the installation's response to the golden figure that undid him. Enduring Sanctity had spent his career reading Forerunner sites the way a priest reads scripture, and the installation was generating designations he had never encountered, frequencies and light patterns that his theological training had no framework for. The Forerunner lexicon he had spent 40 years mastering contained a category he had always considered theoretical, reserved for a being the ancient texts described in terms so elevated they bordered on incoherence. A designation for something the Forerunners had apparently anticipated might one day walk through their doors. The closest translation in the Covenant's theological vocabulary was the unfinished one. A being of immense ancient power who was not Forerunner, but who carried something the Forerunners had recognized as kindred. A being who had walked so long that the universe had worn grooves around his passing. Enduring Sanctity's theology was undergoing a rapid and catastrophic reorganization. Holy Minister, the lead elite murmured, weapon still raised. Your orders? Enduring Sanctity raised one ancient hand. The Covenant boarding party lowered their weapons in unison, with the reluctant precision of soldiers who did not understand the order, but would obey it. The prophet's gravity throne drifted forward until he was 10 meters from the Emperor. And he looked up, considerably up, at the golden figure with an expression that Mara's xenological training identified as the specific combination of terror and reverence that sapient beings reserve for encounters with things that exceed their conceptual frameworks. You are not Forerunner, Enduring Sanctity said, in the Covenant's common tongue, which the Emperor's translator bead. Mara had given him one, and he had examined it for 30 seconds before integrating it as though he had been using the technology for years, rendered into comprehensible sound. But the God's house knows your name. The builders of this place are dead, the Emperor said. They made choices that ended them. I would understand those choices before I judged them. He looked at the prophet with eyes that did not flicker. You have mistaken their legacy for divinity. That error will cost you everything if you do not correct it. Enduring Sanctity was quiet for a long time. Around him, his soldiers shifted with the nervous energy of warriors, watching their commanding officer navigate unmapped theological territory in real time. Then teach us, the prophet said finally, and his voice carried something that had not been in it for 40 years of professional certainty. Doubt. Genuine, searching, terrified doubt. Behind Mara, Perrin's voice arrived in her earpiece like cold water. Doctor, I'm reading a UNSC slipspace signature. 2 Pelicans, no transponder codes, ONI Black Unit. They're 40 minutes out and they are moving fast. The window was closing. The Spartan team was designated Operator 6, and they did not exist. This was standard ONI nomenclature for assets whose operational parameters included actions that could not survive institutional acknowledgement. Operator 6's mission brief, assembled by Admiral Vryce in the 90 minutes since Ostrander's priority obsidian transmission, ran to 47 pages of contingency architecture, built around a core directive that occupied exactly one sentence. Assess, contain, or neutralize the anomalous entity at Etran Harborage before Covenant forces can establish theological or military framework around it. The 4 Spartans in the lead Pelican had read the brief twice each and arrived at the same professional conclusion independently. This was the strangest mission any of them had ever been handed, and they had collectively participated in operations that included detonating a Nova bomb inside a Covenant holy city. Spartan Kira 092 commanded the unit. She was a Spartan 2, one of the original Halsey cohort, which meant she had been taken from her family at 6 years old, augmented at 14, and had spent the subsequent 3 decades as humanity's most effective instrument of violence. She was not, by temperament or training, given to philosophical uncertainty. She looked at the mission brief's single operational sentence and identified 3 immediate problems. First, the entity had entered a Forerunner installation that had resisted all UNSC access attempts for 3 years, and it had done so by walking through a gateway that opened voluntarily. That was not a containment-friendly profile. Second, Covenant forces were already inside. Operator 6 was 4 Spartans and 2 Pelicans. The absolute heresy was a carrier with a complement of approximately 12,000. Third, the brief included Perrin's sensor readings from the Ghost, and Kira 092 had read the thermal data 3 times, and the entity was generating its own heat envelope in hard vacuum. And she did not know what that meant, but she knew it meant the word neutralize in her mission. Brief was doing a considerable amount of optimistic heavy lifting. She briefed her team in the Pelican's hold with the flat efficiency of someone who had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do before a complex operation was oversell your certainty. We go in quiet. We assess. We do not engage unless the situation is already unrecoverable. Our primary objective is intelligence. Secondary is separation. Get our people out if the Covenant presence escalates. Tertiary, and only tertiary, is the containment directive. Questions? Spartan DOS 119 raised one hand. Define unrecoverable. You'll know it when you see it, Kira said, which was the honest answer. They made entry through a maintenance access point that Mara's research team had mapped 18 months earlier. A secondary gateway on the installation's underside that had opened once, briefly, during a power fluctuation, and which Mara had documented with the thoroughness of someone who understood that secondary exits were as important as primary entrances. Perrin threaded them a path through the installation's sensor network, keeping them clear of the Covenant boarding party's position, and Kira moved her team through the Forerunner corridors with the silent precision of people who had been trained since childhood to be the most dangerous thing in any room they entered. She heard the Emperor before she saw him, not his footsteps. He moved with an economy of sound that she recognized as trained, the particular quiet of someone who had spent time learning not to be heard. What she heard was his voice, low and measured, carrying through the installation's resonant corridors with the acoustic clarity of a space designed to transmit sound. He was speaking Sangheili, imperfectly but functionally, and beside him a prophet's gravity throne hummed at conversation altitude. And Mara's team was arranged in a loose cluster nearby, with the specific body language of people who were very frightened, but had decided to be frightened quietly. Kira held her team at the corridor junction and listened for 90 seconds, which was enough time to understand that the situation was already well outside the architecture of her mission brief. The Emperor was conducting what amounted to a theological deconstruction in real time, dismantling enduring sanctity's framework with the systematic patience of someone who had performed this operation before on much larger scales. He was not aggressive. He was not contemptuous. He was precise, which was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. He identified the load-bearing beliefs in the prophet's theology and examined them one by one, not to mock them but to test them. And the prophet was engaging, genuinely engaging, with the scrutiny of a mind that had spent 40 years building certainty and was now watching it develop fractures. The Covenant elite major was watching the Emperor with an expression Kira had never seen on a Sangheili face before. Not hostility, not reverence. Something more complicated. The look of a warrior encountering someone who made him want to understand his own values better. She pulled back from the junction and opened a tight beam channel to Paran. "What is that thing?" she subvocalized. "My best current assessment," Paran said, "is that it is very old, very powerful, and genuinely interested in humanity's survival. That last part I'm inferring from its conversation with Dr. Mara, in which it described our 24-year refusal to surrender as, and I'm quoting, something that matters." Kira processed this. "Oni's directive stands." "Oni's directive," Paran said carefully, "was written by people who had 47 pages of contingency planning and 0 seconds of actual observation. You have 90 seconds of observation. I would weight your assessment accordingly." She would think about that later. Right now, the Covenant brute captain, Torvus, she'd tagged him from his armor markings, a name that appeared in 17 UNSC after-action reports as a confirmed Spartan killer, had separated from the main group and was circling the room's perimeter with the patient, evaluative movement of a predator, taking measure of unfamiliar prey. He wasn't looking at the Emperor. He was looking at the shadows where the corridors met. He was looking for exactly what Kira was, the thing that didn't belong. His eyes found the junction, found her. For 1 second, Kira 092 and Torvus looked at each other across 40 meters of Forerunner corridor and performed the instantaneous mutual assessment that experienced soldiers conduct before the shooting starts. She read his posture, he read hers. They both arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. Then the Emperor said, without turning around, in perfectly accented English, "The Spartans in the corridor. Come in. I have questions for you as well." The brute's eyes snapped to the golden figure. Kira's hand tightened on her battle rifle. Mara closed her eyes briefly in the expression of someone recalculating every assumption they had made in the last hour. Swore the installation pulsed once. Warm and certain. Convergence of significant things. Kira 092 had walked into rooms that were on fire, rooms that were flooding, rooms occupied by flood combat forms in various states of catastrophic biological expression. She had never walked into a room and felt the specific quality of attention that the Emperor directed at her when she crossed the threshold. Not hostile, not threatening, but comprehensive in a way that made her Mjolnir's sensor suite feel like a child's toy. He looked at her the way she looked at tactical maps. Everything registered, everything filed, everything assigned its proper weight. She stopped 4 meters from him and did not lower her battle rifle because she was a professional. 4 Spartans, he said, examining them each in turn. Enhanced, surgically augmented, or a mechanically assisted. The armor is sophisticated. Energy shielding, neural interface, force multiplication. He paused on her for a moment longer than the others. "You are the oldest. You carry more losses than the rest combined. You lead because you have learned what the others have not yet had time to learn." "And what's that?" Kira said flatly. "That victory and survival are not the same thing, and that sometimes you must choose between them." He tilted his head slightly. "You were sent to contain or neutralize me." "Assess first," she said. "Contain or neutralize are tertiary." "And your assessment?" She looked at him for a long moment. Operator Six's protocols covered approximately 800 contingency scenarios. She ran through the ones that applied and found that they all shared the same terminal condition: insufficient. "Aren't that my mission brief needs updating," she said finally. Something moved in his expression that she had learned, in the last 30 seconds of observation, to identify as the closest he came to approval. The elite major had watched this exchange with the focused attention of a warrior cataloging a new variable, and now he stepped forward with the deliberate formality of Sangheili Martial Protocol, a measured approach that announced intent without aggression, the body language of someone requesting engagement on equal terms. He was a head taller than Kira, even in her Mjolnir, and he looked at her with the particular quality of attention that Sangheili warriors reserve for opponents they considered worth their time. "You are the human warrior caste," he said through his translator bead, and in the tone of a statement being tested for accuracy rather than a question being asked. "Spartan too," Kira said. "Yes. I have fought Spartans," the major said. "3 times. 2 of those engagements I survived because my unit was larger and my position was superior. The third," he paused, mandibles moving slightly. "The third I survived because the Spartan chose a different target. I have thought about that choice many times." It was, Kira understood, the most honest thing a Covenant elite had ever said to her. She filed it carefully. The Emperor had moved to the room's far wall, where a Forerunner data terminal was displaying the maps that had alarmed Mara's team earlier. He was reading them with the focused intensity of a commander studying terrain before a battle, and the installation was feeding him data at a rate that Perrin, monitoring through the communication nodes, described in Kira's earpiece as frankly impossible. The translation rate alone should require years of study, and it's been 2 hours. He absorbed the Forerunner star charts, the installation's structural schematics, the fragmented records of the Shield World's original purpose, and then he turned back to the room with the expression of someone who has read a document and understood not just its content, but the mind that wrote it. "The Forerunners were not God," he said, to the room at large but directed at enduring sanctity specifically. "They were architects of survival who made a catastrophic error in their final solution. They understood the flood could not be negotiated with, contained, or converted. This much was correct. Their error was in scope. They built a weapon to kill the flood's food supply rather than the flood itself. They chose the sterilization of the galaxy over the harder problem of defeating a consuming intelligence directly." Enduring Sanctity's gravity throne had drifted incrementally closer during the Emperor's reading of the terminal, the way a scholar leans toward a text that revises everything they thought they knew. "The great journey," he began, "leads to extinction," the Emperor said, "without cruelty but without softness either. Every sapient species in this galaxy, including your own, consumed by a weapon your theology worships. I have read the Forerunners' own records. They did not build the rings as a gift. They built them in despair." He let that settle. "A god who acts from despair is not a god. It is a warning." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a belief system processing a potentially fatal wound. Enduring Sanctity was very still, his ancient eyes moving behind their optical enhancements with the rapid, unfocused motion of a mind working through implications faster than expression could track. The elites in his honor guard exchanged glances that Kira's xenological training identified as significant. The nonverbal communication of warriors watching their commanding officer's certainty undergo structural failure. Torvus, the brute captain, had been quiet through all of this, positioned at the room's edge with his gravity hammer loose at his side, watching the Emperor with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from its starting point of awe. Orny, it had arrived somewhere more complicated. The evaluative focus of a predator reconsidering its classification of something it had initially categorized as prey. Brutes did not process the world through theology or military protocol. They processed it through the hierarchy of strength. And what Torvus was calculating, with the patient brutality of a species that had survived by correctly identifying the most dangerous thing in any given environment, was where the Emperor sat in that hierarchy. He arrived at his conclusion the way brutes always did, directly. "You," he said, stepping forward from the wall. The room's attention shifted to him with the collective tension of people watching a pressure valve reach capacity. He pointed at the Emperor with one massive finger. You fight. It was not a question. It was barely even a challenge. So it was an invitation, offered with the straightforward respect that Jiralhanai reserved for things they considered genuinely worth testing. The emperor looked at him for a moment. Then, with the unhurried calm of someone accepting a cup of tea, he said, "Yes." Kira moved her hand away from her battle rifle's trigger. Whatever was about to happen, she understood instinctively, was not her jurisdiction. The installation's lights shifted again. Not the witness frequency, not the convergence designation. Something older, something that the Forerunner lexicon had stored for 100,000 years without occasion to use. Mara's translator rendered it in a whisper. Demonstration of the worthy. Torvus was not a fool. This was worth establishing clearly, because the decision to challenge the Emperor to single combat in a Forerunner installation, while surrounded by elites, Spartans, and a prophet undergoing a theological crisis, appeared on its surface to be the decision of a fool. It was not. It was the decision of a Jiralhanai captain who had spent 30 years surviving in an organization that murdered its own warriors for weakness, who had learned that the most dangerous moment in any hierarchy was the moment of ambiguity, when the order of things was unclear and everyone was waiting for someone else to establish it. Torvus had watched the room for 2 hours. He had watched the Emperor dismantle a prophet's certainty, hold Spartans at conversation distance, and read Forerunner records like a man reviewing his own mail. And the room was full of significant things with no established relationship to each other. Someone needed to test the load-bearing structure. Torvus had volunteered. He came in with his gravity hammer already swinging, not a telegraphed wind-up but a continuous motion, the weapon transitioning from loose carry to full arc in the space of a single step, the kind of attack that had ended Spartans because it left no window between intent and execution. The gravity hammer's kinetic pulse detonated against the corridor floor 3 centimeters from where the Emperor had been standing, and the shock wave cracked the Forerunner tile in a 6-meter radius and knocked 2 grunts from their feet entirely. The Emperor was not there. He had moved with a speed that Kira's Mjolnir sensors registered, and her eyes did not. Stepping inside the arc with the precise economy of someone who had studied the attack before it landed. And his response was not a weapon draw, but a single open-handed strike to the gravity hammer's shaft that redirected the follow-through entirely. The weapon's momentum carrying Torvus a quarter turn off balance. It was a technique, a specific, nameable technique from a specific tradition of unarmed combat that had no business existing in this universe, applied with force that dented the hammer's shaft. Torvus recovered in one step, which impressed Kira more than she expected, and reset his guard with the adaptive recalibration of a warrior who has been surprised and chosen to learn from it rather than repeat it. He looked at the Emperor with new eyes, not the evaluative calculation of before, something closer to genuine engagement. They went 4 more exchanges. The Emperor did not use the sword at his hip. He did not use whatever psychic capacity Perrin's sensors were registering as a constant low-level output. He used his hands, his mass, his technical precision, countering Torvus's attacks with the minimum necessary force and no more. Not dominating, not humiliating, but demonstrating with absolute clarity the relationship between their respective capabilities. By the 4th exchange, Torvus was bleeding from a cut above his eye where a gauntleted forearm had redirected his own weapon into his guard, and the Emperor had not been touched. Torvus stopped. He lowered the hammer. He looked at the Emperor for a long moment, chest heaving, blood running freely down his jaw, and then he made a sound that his translator rendered as a short, sharp acknowledgement, the Jiralhanai equivalent of a formal bow, offered by warriors to those they had tested and found superior. "Good," Torvus said simply. Then he stepped back to his position at the wall, retrieved a cloth from his armor's utility strap, pressed it to the cut above his eye, and returned to watching the room with the alert patience of a man who had learned what he needed to learn and saw no reason to continue the inquiry. Kira had watched every second of it and was revising her assessments in real time. The Emperor had controlled the entire engagement, not just physically but psychologically, calibrating his response to produce a specific outcome. Torvus was not defeated, he was educated. The distinction was deliberate, and it meant the Emperor was thinking several moves beyond the immediate interaction. She was dealing with a strategist. Enduring Sanctity had watched the exchange from his gravity throne with the expression of a man whose theological crisis had been joined by a military one. The prophet's framework for understanding power was hierarchical and divine. Strength flowed from the forerunners downward, sanctified by faith, expressed through the covenant's ordained order. What he had just watched did not fit that framework. The golden figure had not fought like a god dispensing judgment. He had fought like a teacher conducting a lesson, and the lesson had been offered to a brute with the same patient attention he had given to a prophet's theology. "You treat all things as worth your consideration," Enduring Sanctity said, and there was wonder in it beneath the unease. "Everything that thinks deserves consideration," the Emperor said, returning to the data terminal as though the combat had been a brief administrative interruption. "Even when it is wrong, especially when it is wrong." He pulled up a new display, star charts overlaid with Covenant fleet movement data that the installation's sensor network had been quietly aggregating from subspace traffic. "Your fleet is moving toward Installation 09, a halo ring." Enduring Sanctity was very still. "3 prophet hierarchs and a military escort of 40 ships," the Emperor continued, reading the data with the flat precision of a general briefing. "They intend activation. They believe it will begin the great journey." He turned from the terminal. "It will begin nothing except silence." "How do you know our fleet movements?" the elite major demanded. "This installation has been listening to your slipspace traffic for 3 years, the Emperor said. "Your researchers," he gestured toward Mara's team, "lack the translation framework to read it. I do not." He looked at Kira. "Your Admiral Vryce will have this same intelligence within the hour. Oni will begin moving assets. They will be insufficient." Kira was already on a tight beam channel to Perim. "Get me a line to the Ghost. Priority Obsidian, now." "Already composing," Perrin said. "Yael is going to have a very difficult morning." The Emperor turned back to the room. Spartans, elites, a brute, a prophet, out-human scientists, and looked at each of them with those burning eyes that carried the weight of 10,000 years of a different galaxy survival. "The rings must not fire," he said. It was not a tactical assessment. It was something older and more fundamental. The declaration of someone who had spent millennia fighting the same battle under different names, who recognized the shape of extinction the way a sailor recognizes a storm by the color of the sky. Everything else is secondary. Outside, in the dark of the Atron Harborage system, a flood tendril ship drifted out of the installation's sensor shadow, where it had been hiding for 6 hours, drawn by something it had never encountered before. A psychic signature it could not classify, vast and sealed and deeply interesting to a hive mind that had consumed 100,000 civilizations and never found anything it could not eventually understand. The grave mind had been patient for 100,000 years. It could be patient a little longer. The flood tendril ship was a small thing by the parasite standards. A repurposed Covenant corvette that had been consumed 6 months earlier near Installation 04's debris field. Its original hull geometry still recognizable beneath the biological reformation that had overtaken it. Masses of gray-brown infection material had replaced its armor plating in sections, and the ship moved through space with the slightly irregular rhythm of something that was simultaneously a vessel and an organism. One, its navigation no longer governed by mechanical systems, but by the distributed intelligence of a billion infection forms acting in concert toward a single directed purpose. Peran detected it at the same moment the installation's sensor network flagged it, and his voice in Kira's earpiece carried a quality she had never heard from him before. Not fear exactly, but the specific register of an AI encountering something that exceeded its threat modeling architecture. "Flood vessel," he said, "bearing 274, range 40 kilometers, closing at 1/3 standard. It has been in sensor shadow for approximately 6 hours. A pause. It was already here when we arrived." Kira relayed this to the room in 3 words. "Flood, 40 kilometers." The effect was immediate and clarifying. On the Covenant boarding party's internal tensions, the Prophet's theological crisis, the elite major's complicated evaluation, Torvis's settled watchfulness, collapsed instantly into a unified combat posture that required no orders and no coordination. Grunts scrambled for cover. Elites ignited energy swords. Torvus lifted his gravity hammer with the focused readiness of a warrior for whom the flood represented something beyond enemy, something that negated the entire framework of honorable conflict and replaced it with pure survival calculus. Even enduring sanctity's gravity throne rose 2 meters, putting distance between the prophet and the floor, with the instinctive self-preservation of a species that understood viscerally what flood infection forms did to organic tissue at ground level. The Emperor had gone still, not the stillness of surprise. He had been still like this once before, when he first arrived and reached for a warp that wasn't there. This was the stillness of recognition. He turned toward the installation's outer wall, as though he could see through it across 40 kilometers of vacuum to the tendril ship beyond, and what moved across his face was not fear, but something Mara had no clinical term for. The expression of someone meeting an old enemy, wearing a new face, and finding the meeting exactly as unwelcome as every previous encounter. The consuming intelligence, he said. The flood, Mara confirmed. It's drawn to the installation's power signature. Standard flood behavior near Forerunner. It is not drawn to the installation, the Emperor said. He had not moved, and his voice carried the flat certainty of a diagnosis rather than a hypothesis. It is drawn to me. The room absorbed this. Your psychic output, Kira said slowly. Peraine's been reading it as a low-level constant since you arrived. The flood's central intelligence, the grave mind, it coordinates through biological neural networks. If it can sense, a mind it cannot categorize, the Emperor said. Yes, the grave mind has consumed civilizations. It carries their memories, their knowledge, their cognitive architecture. It has encountered every variety of sapient thought this galaxy has produced and absorbed it into its composite understanding. He finally turned from the wall. It has never encountered a mind from outside this universe. It is curious. The grave mind doesn't do curious, DOS 119 said from the doorway. As it does consume. Curiosity and consumption are not mutually exclusive, the Emperor said. In my experience, the most dangerous predators are the ones that want to understand what they are eating. The tendril ship had closed to 20 kilometers. The installation's point defense systems, dormant Forerunner automated platforms that Mara's team had spent 18 months failing to activate, came online without any input, their targeting solutions painting the approaching vessel with the calm efficiency of technology that had been designed specifically for this contingency. The installation had containment protocols for flood incursion. It was running them. But the tendril ship was not attempting entry. It was holding position at 18 kilometers, which was unusual enough that Param flagged it immediately. See, flood vessels did not hold position. They closed, they rammed, they deployed infection forms through any available breach. Holding position implied a directing intelligence overriding the parasite's base consumption drive, which meant the grave mind was present in this vessel's coordination, which meant this was not a standard flood incursion. This was an introduction. A communication burst arrived through the installation's antenna network. Not radio, not slip-space signal, but a modulated biological frequency that the installation's systems translated with evident reluctance, as though the act of rendering the gravemind's words into comprehensible language was itself a contamination risk. The translation appeared on Mara's terminal in segments, each one assembling with the cadenced deliberateness of a mind that communicated in poetry because it had consumed enough poets to understand that rhythm carried meaning that prose could not. Ancient light in a young dark. We have tasted 10,000 minds and found their edges. Yours has no edge we recognize. You are not from the garden we have harvested. We would know what grows in your soil before we consume it. The Emperor read the terminal. His expression did not change. It wants to talk, Torvus said, with the profound disgust of a Jirohanai for whom the flood represented everything antithetical to honorable existence. It wants to evaluate, the Emperor corrected. There is a difference. Talking is social. Evaluation is strategic. He was quiet for a moment. I have spoken with things that wanted to consume me before. The conversation is always the same. They believe understanding what you are will give them leverage over what you are. They are sometimes correct. And when they're not? Kira asked. When they are not, the Emperor said, the conversation ends and something else begins. He looked at the terminal one more time, at the Gravemind's assembled words, and then at Kira. Your fleet at Installation 09. How long before those prophets attempt activation? Perrin answered before Kira could. Based on the fleet movement data the installation has been aggregating, approximately 19 hours. Then we have time for one conversation and no time for two. The Emperor turned to Enduring Sanctity. The prophet had been very quiet since the flood's arrival, his theological crisis temporarily suspended by something more immediate. But his eyes had been moving between the Emperor and the flood translation with the rapid calculation of a mind that was beginning to assemble a picture it had not expected to see. Your fleet at the ring. Can you reach them? I have command authority over the Ministerium fleet, Enduring Sanctity said carefully. The hierarchs commanding the activation force are of higher rank. My authority has limits. Then we will need to be persuasive, the Emperor said. He began moving toward the corridor. Spartan, bring your team. Minister, your phantoms will carry us to your carrier. Major, he addressed the elite, who straightened with the automatic response of a warrior receiving orders from someone his instincts had already classified as command authority. Your unit secures the research team. They do not leave this installation until we return. And the flood vessel? Kira asked. The Emperor paused at the corridor mouth and looked back at the terminal where the Gravemind's words still waited for a response. He reached past Mara and typed 4 words into the translation interface, which rendered them into the biological frequency and transmitted without waiting for confirmation. We will speak after. The tendril ship held position. The Gravemind, apparently, was willing to wait. It respects the appointment, Perrin said, with the tone of someone filing this information in a folder labeled Things I Never Expected to Observe. They moved toward the phantoms. Imran and the installation's lights shifted once more behind them. Cycling through witness and convergence and demonstration of the worthy and arriving finally at a designation that Mara's translator had not rendered before, pulling it from the deepest archive of the Forerunner lexicon, a category that the ancient builders had apparently reserved for moments when the variables in play exceeded their predictive modeling. The closest English approximation her software could construct was the shape of things turning. The flood tendril ship was a modest horror by the parasite standards, a converted Covenant corvette consumed over what xenobiologists estimated was approximately 72 hours, its original hull still partially visible beneath the biological overgrowth, like a skeleton wearing its killer as a coat. When it moved with the purposeful drift of something pretending to be debris, riding the system's gravitational gradients with the patient intelligence of a predator that understood the value of appearing harmless. Perrin detected it through the installation's outer sensor network and spent 0.008 seconds, determining that the contact was not geological before his voice arrived in every earpiece, simultaneously with the particular flatness he reserved for information that could not be improved by tone. Flood contact, single vessel, modified Covenant corvette, bearing 27 Mark IV relative to the installation's outer hull. It has been stationary for approximately 6 hours. It is not stationary anymore. The room's dynamics change instantly and completely, the way a room changes when someone opens a door to reveal a fire. And the theological tension between the Emperor and Enduring Sanctity, the careful professional assessment Kira had been conducting, the brute's patient watchfulness, all of it compressed into the singular focus that the flood produced in every sapient species that had encountered it and survived long enough to develop an instinctive response. Even the grunts, who had been quietly terrified since the Emperor's arrival, recalibrated their terror towards something more familiar and more immediately actionable. The elite major moved to the corridor entrance with his plasma rifle charged before Perrin finished speaking. His honor guard flanked him with the automatic precision of warriors whose training had drilled flood response protocols into muscle memory. Torvis, still pressing the cloth to his eye, retrieved his gravity hammer with his free hand and positioned himself at the room's secondary entrance with the calm efficiency of a man who had fought the flood before and understood that efficiency was the only luxury you got. Kira assessed her team with a glance and issued 3 words through their private channel. Standard flood protocols. DOS 119 and the other two Spartans spread to cover angles without further instruction. The Emperor had turned from the data terminal and was very still, his eyes closed, his head slightly tilted. The posture of someone listening to something no one else could hear. Then his eyes opened, and what was in them was different from anything Kira had seen there before. Not alarm, not the patient calculation of a strategist. Something older and more personal. Puerner, the expression of a man who has spent 10,000 years fighting a specific kind of darkness and has just heard it knock on a door he thought he had closed behind him. "It is not the same," he said quietly, as though answering a question no one had asked aloud. "The mechanism is different, but the intent—" He stopped. "The intent is identical." "You've fought something like the Flood before," Mara said. "I have fought things the Flood would recognize as kin," he said. "Consuming intelligences that express themselves through the bodies of the consumed. The specific biology differs. The philosophical architecture is the same. The belief that existence is expressed through assimilation, that the highest form of being is totality." His jaw tightened slightly. "I have a particular distaste for that philosophy," Perrin interrupted with the tone of someone delivering news that made previous news seem manageable. "The tendril ship is not approaching the installation. It is approaching the absolute heresy, and the carrier's point defense systems are not active. Their sensors may not have acquired the contact yet." Enduring Sanctity's head snapped toward his elite communications officer, a rapid string of commands issuing in Sangheili, too fast for the translator bead to fully track. The officer moved to a Forerunner terminal that Mara's team had spent 3 weeks learning to interface with, and which the officer used in 30 seconds, establishing a tight beam channel to the carrier with the effortless familiarity of a species that had been working with Forerunner technology for centuries. The warning went out. They were 40 seconds too late. Perrin's next report arrived with the particular flatness of information that was accurate and terrible simultaneously. "Floodboarding action in progress on the Absolute Heresy. The tendril ship has deployed infection forms through the carrier's ventral docking ports. I'm reading biological contamination spreading through the lower decks. The carrier's internal defense systems are engaging, but..." A pause of 0.003 seconds, which from Perrin was an eternity. "The Flood has been aboard for approximately 4 hours. They used the tendril ship's approach as misdirection. The primary infection vector was delivered before I detected the vessel." The room processed this in silence. 4 hours. The Flood had been inside the Absolute Heresy for 4 hours, moving through its lower decks with the patient inevitability of a tide, converting the carrier's 12,000 crew one contact at a time, building toward the threshold mass that would trigger exponential spread. The tendril ship had not been approaching. It had been waiting to see whether the installation's occupants would notice, waiting to assess the variables, waiting with the Gravemind's geological patience for the optimal moment to reveal what it had already accomplished. It had been studying the Emperor for 6 hours. Kira understood the implication immediately and felt it settle into her tactical assessment like a stone into water. The Gravemind did not expose its gambits without purpose. It had revealed the tendril ship now, at this moment, because it wanted the installation's occupants to know about the carrier. It wanted them moving. It wanted them reactive. The Flood's greatest tactical advantage was the panic of the consumed species, the desperate scramble to save individuals that pulled defenders out of position and fed the infection's spread. She looked at the Emperor. He was looking at her, and she understood from his expression that he had reached the same conclusion 3 seconds before she had. "It wants us to go to the carrier?" she said. "It wants me to go to the carrier," he said. "The rest of you are secondary considerations." He turned toward the corridor with the deliberate calm of someone accepting an invitation they have been expecting. "The Gravemind has encountered my psychic signature and cannot classify it. A consciousness that has consumed 100,000 civilizations and never found something it could not understand. It is curious. Curiosity in the Flood is indistinguishable from hunger. Then going to the carrier is exactly what it wants," DOS 119 said. "Yes," the Emperor said. "I find that I have limited patience for things that want to consume me." He looked at Kira. "I need the carrier's internal schematics, its remaining uncontaminated sections, and whatever your people know about Flood containment protocols, I need it in the next 4 minutes. Pairing, Kira said. Already compiling, the AI said. And there was something in his voice that Kira had never heard there before. The particular timbre of an intelligence that was genuinely uncertain whether the entity it was assisting was going to save them or detonate the situation entirely, and had decided to assist anyway because the alternative was worse. Enduring Sanctity had not moved from his gravity throne. He was looking at the Emperor with the expression of a man watching the theological event of the millennium, occurring in real time. His 40 years of certainty lying in pieces around him, and something new and terrifying assembling itself from the wreckage. If the carrier falls, he said, 12,000 of the Covenant's faithful will be beyond saving, the Emperor said, without gentleness but without contempt. The question is not how many can be saved. The question is, how many more will die if the carrier's flood mass reaches critical threshold, and I am standing here discussing it? He looked at the prophet one final time. The great journey ends aboard that ship if we do not move. Not transcendence, not divinity, infection. That is what your faith has been carrying toward. He turned and walked toward the corridor, and Kira fell into step behind him because the mission brief was ash and the situation was what it was. And she was a Spartan, and Spartans finished the fight. Behind them in the Forerunner installation's deep data networks, something shifted. A signal, narrow and deliberate, transmitted outward from the shield world's communication array on a frequency that the installation's own systems had not used in 100,000 years. It reached the tendril ship in zero point 0.4 seconds. It reached something considerably larger, waiting in the dark beyond the system's outer edge, in 6.2 seconds. The Gravemind received it, processed it, and for the first time in its vast consuming existence, experienced something that its assimilated minds had no adequate framework for. It experienced doubt. The Flood Tendril ship was a converted Covenant frigate, which was itself a theological obscenity that the Covenant had never needed to reckon with because the Covenant had never survived long enough in flood-controlled space to observe the process. It had been a vessel of worship once, the pious declaration, a ministerial transport that had made the mistake of investigating an anomalous signal near a flood containment facility 6 months earlier. What moved it now had no interest in its original designation. It had stripped the crew, integrated the useful biological material, and repurposed the vessel as a probe tendril, an extension of the Gravemind's distributed intelligence, sent ahead to assess a psychic signature that had appeared in the installation's vicinity like a lit match in a dark room. Paran detected it at a range of 40,000 kilometers, which was not enough warning by any reasonable operational standard. Flood contact, he said in Kira's earpiece, and the flatness of his delivery was the AI equivalent of a scream. Single vessel, Covenant frigate hull, biomass infection reading at approximately 80%. It is not moving aggressively. It is holding position at the installation's outer sensor perimeter. It is a pause. It appears to be waiting. Kira had her team moving before Perrin finished the sentence, pushing back through the corridor to the junction point with the automatic efficiency of Spartans for whom the word flood triggered a specific and well-rehearsed cascade of tactical priorities. She opened the channel to the main chamber simultaneously. Dr. Mara, flood contact, outer perimeter, single vessel. We need everyone in a defensible position now. The effect on the Covenant forces was immediate and instructive. The elite major's professional composure, which had survived theological deconstruction, Spartan first contact, and a brute exhibition match without visible fracture, cracked cleanly at the word flood. He issued rapid commands in Sangheili and his unit shifted to a new formation. Tighter, oriented outward, plasma weapons charged to full output. The grunts made sounds that transcended their translator beads entirely. Even Torvis, still pressing cloth to his cut, straightened with the full-body alertness of a predator recognizing a threat category beyond the normal hierarchy. Enduring Sanctity's reaction was the most revealing. His gravity throne rose 2 feet higher, involuntarily, the way a man steps back from a ledge before his conscious mind has processed the drop. The prophet had spent 40 years in Forerunner installations. He understood, at a cellular level, that theology could not fully insulate what the flood's presence near a Forerunner site meant. The Emperor had not moved. He stood at the data terminal, reading the new information that Paran was threading through the installation's communication nodes. Mach, with the stillness of someone processing a development that was significant but not surprising. His eyes moved across the incoming data, the tendril ship's position, its holding pattern, the specific quality of its weighting, and then he closed them briefly, and Kira's MJOLNIR sensors registered a spike in the low-level psychic output she had been tracking since she entered the room. It lasted 3 seconds. Then it stopped. "It came for me," he said. "The flood doesn't target individuals," Kira said. "The flood targets minds it cannot classify." He opened his eyes. "It has encountered nothing like me. A consuming intelligence that cannot categorize a potential host is not aggressive. It is curious. Curiosity precedes assessment. Assessment precedes action." He looked at the sensor feed Paran had routed to the terminal display. It is listening. Listening for what? For weakness. For the gap between what I am and what I can defend. He was quiet for a moment. It will not find one, but it will look for a long time. Mara had moved her research team into the installation's inner corridor network, using the structural maps her people had spent 3 years compiling. She pulled up the defensive schematic on her datapad with the focused calm of someone channeling fear into useful work. "The installation has internal hard light barriers," she said. "We documented 17 separate barrier nodes during our survey. If we can activate them—" "They are already active," the Emperor said. "I activated them 12 minutes ago." Mara looked at him. "You activated Forerunner hard light barriers." The installation understood the request. He said it the way someone says the door was unlocked. A simple statement of access, rather than a demonstration of capability. "The flood vessel cannot breach the outer hull without triggering a defensive response that will make the interior untenable for biological infection forms. We have time." "Time for what?" the elite major asked. "To decide what we do next." The Emperor turned from the terminal and addressed the room with the directness of a commander calling a council of war. Not performing authority, not demanding deference, but applying the organizational clarity of someone who had spent millennia turning disparate groups into functional coalitions. The flood's presence changes the calculation. A tendril ship does not travel alone in strategic terms. It travels ahead. There is a larger presence in this system, or there will be. The Gravemind sent this vessel specifically because it detected something worth the Gravemind's personal attention. That means we have a window before it escalates its response, and we must use that window. He looked at Kira. "Your UNSC needs to know the flood is active in this system and that the tendril ship's holding pattern suggests directed intelligence rather than opportunistic infection spread. That changes their threat assessment significantly." He looked at the elite major. "Your Ministerium fleet moving toward Installation 09 is now a liability rather than simply a threat. If the flood follows that fleet to a halo ring, Anaina, the temptation to activate the ring as a solution becomes catastrophic. I need you to understand why that cannot happen." He looked at Enduring Sanctity, who had descended from his elevated throne position during the last few minutes in the unconscious body language of a being shedding altitude as it shed certainty. "And you," the Emperor said more quietly, "you have spent 40 years building toward a moment you now understand would end everything. What you do with that understanding in the next hour will matter more than the 40 years that preceded it." The prophet looked at him for a long time. The optical enhancements over his eyes caught the Forerunner light in a way that made him look, briefly, ancient and sad and very tired. "I have subordinates," Enduring Sanctity said slowly, "who have spent their lives in absolute faith. Who will die for the great journey without hesitation. Who are, at this moment, aboard 40 ships moving toward a ring that you are telling me will kill everything." He paused. "How do you tell people that the thing they would die for is the thing that will kill them?" "Carefully," the Emperor said, "and without contempt. They believe sincerely. Sincere belief deserves honest correction, not mockery." He held the prophet's gaze. "I have done this before, on a scale that would exhaust your comprehension. It is the hardest work there is, and it is never finished, and it is the only work that matters." Outside, the flood tendril ship rotated slowly on its axis, and in the cold dark of the Etron harborage system, something vast and patient and very hungry turned its distributed attention toward the installation and began, with the methodical thoroughness of a mind that had never encountered a problem it could not eventually solve, to think. The Gravemind spoke at 0347 installation time, and its voice came through every communication channel simultaneously. It did not use the Flood's standard contact methodology, the biological override, the corrupted signal, the whispered promises threaded through a dying host's vocal cords. It used the installation's own communication infrastructure, threading its signal through the Forerunner nodes with a technical fluency that told Perrin in the 0.004 seconds before he began countermeasures that the Gravemind had been studying the installation's architecture for considerably longer than 6 hours. It had been patient, it had been thorough, and now it had decided that patience had yielded sufficient data. The voice that emerged from the installation speakers was vast and layered and ancient. Not the voice of a single organism, but the compressed chorus of every mind the Flood had ever consumed. 1 billion dead intelligences filtered through a central will that had existed since before the Forerunners built the rings to stop it. It spoke in a language that was simultaneously Sangheili, English, and something older. The Forerunner tongue that the Emperor had been learning from the installation's own records, delivered with a native fluency that confirmed the Gravemind's consumption of Forerunner-era hosts. It said, "You are new. You are not from here. You carry something I have not tasted in 100,000 years." The Emperor stood in the center of the main chamber and listened to it the way he had listened to everything in this universe, with total attention and no visible fear. "I have consumed gods," the Gravemind continued, its voice filling the corridors, pressing against the hard light barriers with something that was not physical force but felt like it. "I have consumed the faithful and the faithless, the strong and the desperate, the ancient and the newly born. I have consumed civilizations that believe themselves beyond consumption. You are flesh and will and something older than this universe's memory. I am curious." "You should be," the Emperor said aloud to the air, to the speakers, to the distributed intelligence pressing against the installation's defenses. His voice carried no performance in it. Not bravado, not threat, not fear. Simple statement. "I am the only thing in your experience that you cannot model from prior consumption. That uncertainty is correct. Honor it." "Join with me," the Gravemind said, and the layered voices carried something that in a lesser intelligence would have been called hunger, but in the Gravemind was more precisely described as taxonomic imperative. The need of a consuming mind to classify and integrate the unclassified. "Your knowledge, your years, the shape of a universe I have never touched. Give them freely and I will preserve the pattern of you more completely than any host I have ever consumed. You will persist. You will be remembered. Every mind you have consumed believed it would persist," the Emperor said. "None of them do. You carry their biological memory without their essential identity. What you offer is not preservation. It is taxidermy." A pause. Long enough that Kira's tactical awareness flagged it. The Gravemind did not pause. It processed faster than biological thought, and silence from it meant something was being recalculated. "Then we are at impasse," it said finally. "You will not join. I cannot consume what I cannot breach. But I am patient, ancient thing. I have waited before." "You will not wait here," the Emperor said, "because I am going to give you something more immediately interesting to consider." He looked at Kira. "The fleet at Installation 09. How long before they reach activation range?" Perrin answered before Kira could. 11 hours. The UNSC assets Admiral Vryce dispatched are 8 hours out. They'll arrive after the Covenant fleet is in position. Huddy, insufficient force to prevent activation by conventional engagement. "Then we will not use conventional engagement." He turned to Enduring Sanctity. "You have command authority over the absolute heresy. Can you issue a fleet-wide theological directive that your ministerium ships are bound to obey?" The prophet straightened slowly, and something in his bearing had changed over the last hours. The collapse of certainty had left, not rubble, but something cleaner underneath. The structural honesty of a mind that had been built for rigorous theological thought and had simply for 40 years been thinking about the wrong things. "A ministerium interdiction," he said. A declaration that a site or action is theologically prohibited pending hierarchical review. It carries absolute authority over any fleet operating under ministerium sanction. He paused. I have never issued one against a halo ring. You have never had reason to, the emperor said. You have reason now. Enduring Sanctity looked at the emperor for a long moment. The golden figure with the burning eyes who had walked through vacuum and read Forerunner records like morning correspondence, and fought a brute captain to an educational conclusion, and now stood in a Forerunner installation with a flood, tendril ship pressing against its defenses, and spoke to the Gravemind the way a man speaks to a problem he has already solved in his mind. The prophet thought about 40 years of certainty. He thought about the records on the terminal. He thought about the Forerunners building rings from despair. Once he reached for his communication array. What followed was not elegant. Enduring Sanctity's Ministerium interdiction transmission reached the fleet at installation 09 40 minutes later, and the response was immediate and fractious. 3 of the fleet's commanders were theological hardliners who challenged the interdiction's authority on procedural grounds, and 2 of the prophet hierarchs aboard the command vessel attempted to countermand it entirely. The resulting command crisis consumed 6 hours of the fleet's operational window, during which it held position outside activation range while its senior officers conducted the theological equivalent of a knife fight in a locked room. It was enough. The UNSC Force Admiral Vryce had dispatched 7 ships, led by the destroyer Stalingrad, arrived during the command crisis and took up blocking positions between the Covenant fleet and the ring with the specific tactical geometry of commanders who had been told, via priority obsidian channel, that they needed to hold a line rather than win an engagement. They were outgunned 4-1. They held anyway because humanity in 2549 had learned to hold lines that should not hold, because the alternative was not holding them. The Gravemind had watched all of this. Its tendril ship had remained at the installation's perimeter, not pressing the hard light barriers, waiting with the patience of a distributed intelligence that experienced time differently than biological minds. And then it did something that Prane flagged as unprecedented in UNSC flood encounter records. It transmitted a single burst signal on the Emperor's confirmed psychic frequency, not through the installation speakers, but directly, the way a mind reaches for another mind. And what it sent was not words. It sent a question. The Emperor stood in the main chamber and received it, and his expression did something Kira had not seen it do before. It stilled in a way that was different from his normal stillness. Not the composure of a commander processing information, but the specific quality of someone confronting a question that reaches deep enough to require honest consideration. He stood there for 11 seconds. Then he answered silently, and the tendril ship powered its drives and moved away from the installation and did not return. Kira looked at him. What did it ask you? He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sensor feed track the flood vessel's departure vector. It asked whether I believed the pattern of a mind persisted after death, he said, or whether death was simply the end of the pattern. What did you tell it? The truth, and he said, that I have spent 10,000 years trying to ensure the question remains answerable by the living. He turned from the sensor feed. It found that more interesting than consuming me, for now. Outside, the absolute heresy turned its drives toward Installation 09, carrying a prophet who had 40 years of certainty to dismantle and a transmission to deliver. The UNSC destroyers held their line. The Covenant fleet's command crisis burned itself toward resolution, and somewhere in the dark, the Gravemind moved away and thought about an answer it had never received before. The ring did not fire. Everything after that was merely the work. The work took 3 months. This was not how the UNSC had imagined it would go. Admiral Vryce's operational framework, assembled in the hours after Ostrander's priority obsidian transmission, had contained 47 pages of contingency architecture built around discrete outcomes: contain, neutralize, weaponize, quarantine. What it had not contained was a contingency for the anomalous entity spends 3 months restructuring the theological foundations of a Covenant ministerium fleet, while simultaneously advising UNSC Tactical Command on flood containment doctrine and teaching a Spartan 2 the Forerunner linguistic framework for reading Shield World records. That particular outcome had not made the list because no one in Section 3's analytical division had possessed the imaginative range to write it down. The emperor had not asked permission for any of it. He had simply begun, with the methodical patience of someone who had learned long ago that the most effective way to change a large system was to change the minds inside it, one conversation at a time. Enduring sanctity became the unlikely instrument of the first shift, a prophet whose theological crisis had resolved not into collapse, but into the particular clarity of a scholar who has discovered that the subject he has spent his life studying is more complex and more honest than the doctrine he was taught to apply to it. The high minister's interdiction held, and the three hardline commanders challenged it twice more and were overruled twice more, their procedural objections running aground on the accumulated weight of Forerunner records that Enduring Sanctity had transmitted to the fleet in a data package that took 40 hours to review and left most recipients profoundly unsettled. Not all of them were unsettled in the same direction. This was the part that Oni had not anticipated and could not fully control. The Emperor's influence on the Covenant forces was not uniformly moderating. Two of the elite commanders who reviewed the Forerunner records emerged from the experience not with doubt, but with a cold and focused rage. Not at the Emperor, not at humanity, but at the prophet hierarchs who had known, or should have known, that the great journey was a path to annihilation, and had led their people down it anyway. The elite major from Enduring Sanctity's boarding party, whose name Kira had finally learned was Fal Ramus, spent 6 hours in conversation with the Emperor and emerged from it with the bearing of a warrior who has found a cause worth the full weight of his honor. He requested an audience with Arbiter Thel Vadam's representatives 3 weeks later. The Emperor had suggested it. He had not explained why, but Kira had been present for enough of his strategic conversations by then to understand that he thought in timescales that made Oni's 47 pages of contingency planning look like a grocery list. He was not managing the immediate situation. He was managing the decade that followed it. The Flood tendril ship did not return to the Atron harborage system. A Perrin tracked its departure vector to the edge of the system's outer boundary and then lost it in the slipspace noise. And the question of where the Gravemind had gone and what it had taken from its encounter with the Emperor sat in UNSC threat assessment files as an open entry that no analyst could close because no analyst had a framework for what had happened. The leading theory, which Perrin had composed and which Bryce had classified at the highest available clearance, was that the Gravemind had encountered something that genuinely surprised it, a mind it could neither consume nor fully model, and had withdrawn to think. This was either reassuring or deeply alarming, depending on how you felt about the Gravemind, having occasion to think carefully about anything. Kira 092 spent most of the 3 months in the Emperor's company, which was not something her mission brief had authorized and which she had decided on approximately day 4 to continue anyway. She was a Spartan too. She had been making unauthorized judgment calls since she was old enough to understand what authorization meant. The Emperor was the most tactically significant entity she had encountered in 30 years of warfare, and the most tactically significant thing she could do was understand him. What she came to understand over 3 months of observation was this: he was not here to save humanity. He was not here to lead humanity. He was not, in the deepest sense, here to do anything for humanity at all. He was here because the universe that contained him had expelled him into this one. And he had arrived to find a version of the species he had spent 10,000 years shepherding, standing on the edge of extinction, and he had looked at them. Not their military, not their technology, not their strategic value, but at them, at the quality of their refusal, at the specific texture of a civilization that had been losing for 24 years and had not stopped. And he had found something in that observation that he had not expected to find. He had found something worth his time. He told her this on the last night before he left the installation, standing at the Shield World's outer observation deck where the stars of the Atron harborage system spread in cold silence beyond the viewport. He had spent an hour looking at them before he spoke. "In my universe," he said, "when I built an empire to protect humanity from things it could not protect itself from, I made choices in that building that I would make differently now. I demanded too much. I explained too little. I treated the species I was protecting as a destination rather than a process." He was quiet for a moment. "What I find here is different. Your humanity has not been protected from its worst possibilities. It has been thrown into them repeatedly, and it is still standing, and it has learned things from the standing that my humanity, sheltered, directed, shaped, was not permitted to learn. Kira looked at him. Is that better or worse? It is more honest, he said. Whether it is better depends on whether they survive to use what they have learned. He turned from the viewport. They will need help with that. He did not specify what form that help would take. He had not in 3 months specified anything he was not ready to execute, and Kira had learned that his silences were not evasions, but preparations. Something was coming. Something he had been working towards since the moment he stepped through the Forerunner gateway and began reading the installation's records. She asked him directly on the morning he departed, "What do you want?" He looked at her with those burning eyes for a long moment. "The same thing I have always wanted," he said, "a humanity that survives long enough to deserve its own future." He paused. "And this time, perhaps, to build that future alongside them rather than above them." He walked back through the installation's inner corridors toward the gateway that had welcomed him. Sugar and the Forerunner lights pulsed in his wake. That deep, resonant frequency that Mara's translation team had been trying to classify for 3 months without success. The closest rendering they had arrived at, after extensive debate, was not witness and not convergence, and not demonstration of the worthy. It was something that combined all three into a single designation that the Forerunner lexicon had stored for 100,000 years, apparently waiting for the occasion to use it. It translated imperfectly as the one who does not stop. The Emperor of Mankind did not leave the Halo universe. He had no mechanism to return, and more importantly, he had found a reason to stay. In the months that followed, Oni filed 17 classified reports on his movements, none of which fully captured what he was doing. Which was the same thing he had always done, walking among humanity, reading its wounds, calculating what it needed and what it could bear, and beginning quietly and without announcement the long work of helping a species learn to survive, not because it was protected from the dark, but because it had looked into the dark long enough to understand it. The Covenant's theological fractures, seeded by enduring sanctity's transmissions, and widened by Fal Rames's outreach to the swords of Sangheli, would not resolve cleanly. Nothing the Emperor touched resolved cleanly. He worked in the medium of minds, and minds were not clean. But the fleet at Installation 09 turned back, and the ring did not fire, and somewhere in the dark the grave mind carried an answer it had never received before, and thought about what it meant. A reach would still fall. The war's terrible momentum could not be stopped by one being, however ancient, however capable. The Emperor understood this and did not attempt the impossible. He attempted the necessary, the preservation of the knowledge, the relationships, the fractures in the Covenant's certainty that would matter when the war's final accounting came due. He had done this before. He knew how long it took. He had learned at terrible cost in another universe. What happened when you tried to do it faster than the material allowed? This time, he would be patient. This time, he would explain.